The moderator for tonight's program is Christopher Lydon, who many of you will know as creator and former host of The Connection on WBUR. He's a graduate of Roxbury Latin High School and Yale and has worked as a broadcast and print journalist for more than 30 years. During that time, he has served with the Washington Bureau of the New York Times and with the 10 o'clock news on WGBH as the anchor. In 1993, Mr. Lydon was a candidate for mayor of Boston on the ticket of a citizens' campaign for radical school reform. Currently, he is a fellow at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society at the Harvard Law School, and you can see him on the web at his newest venture, www.christopherlydon.org. We encourage you to visit, and we're happy to have him here with us tonight. Thank you all.
Thank you, Tom, and it's awfully nice to be back at the Ford Hall Forum. Afghanistan, which is what we're talking about tonight, has been a byword most of my life for the far away, the exotic, the irrelevant. Afghanistanism was a phrase in journalistic parlance that meant running away from your own neighborhood, sort of to go to the ends of the earth to talk about a place that almost nobody has ever seen and that almost nobody ever cared about. In Kipling's marvelous telling, in books like Kim and in a wonderful story, The Man Who Would Be King, Afghanistan was a very vivid sort of no man's land between the Russian Empire heading south and British India. It was an enormously alluring but infinitely stony, unmasterable, virtually unknowable space that was plied almost exclusively by horse thieves, traders, and spies. About Kipling, I just say I kept wishing after 9/11 that he were around to tell George Bush something about Afghanistan and to caution him a little bit about the hunt for a handful of anonymous suspects in all those valleys and mountainsides and caves. But then, by then, Afghanistan became the front line of a new American war, a war on terrorism that became a war on the Taliban, that became a war not exactly on Afghanistan, a war to redeem Afghanistan perhaps, but God knows from what. Which brings us to this evening. What, if anything, are we learning about this opposite face of the world? How do we know it? Who's telling us? Why are they telling us? Can we believe them? What is the story all about? We have an unusual privilege tonight to hear from husband and wife Paul Fitzgerald and Liz Gould. In 1981, not long after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, late Carter, early Reagan, you remember it was why the United States didn't go to the Moscow Olympics in 1980, as I recall. Paul and Liz were the first American reporters into Soviet Afghanistan with camera, and they have just returned and just come back with fresh footage that you're going to show us tonight. Bob Zelnick, I think of him as a sort of thinking man's Wolf Blitzer of his time. He was the ABC's Pentagon man. He's now the chairman of the journalism department at Boston University, covered the Pentagon and Moscow and Tel Aviv in more than 20 years at the network. He's also the biographer of Al Gore, and more recently an author of an examination of the Florida returns of 2000. It's a pleasure to be among them. I'm going to ask first Liz Gould and Paul Fitzgerald to tell us about Afghanistan.
Well, first, we would like to thank the Ford Hall Forum and Tom Formicalla for inviting us here to discuss this incredibly important issue. Our experience began in Afghanistan 21 years ago, but it was 9/11 that finally brought the story back home to America. Having just returned from Afghanistan on a fact-finding mission of the journalistic community, we discovered 75% of Kabul is in ruins. Most of the destruction occurred when the U.S.-backed Mujahideen turned their weapons on the Afghan people from 1992 to 96. According to many of the journalists we interviewed in Kabul, they were heading off to Iraq, and rumors on the street challenged the veracity of President Bush's promise to the Afghan people. If war comes to Iraq, many Afghans believe the U.S. will desert Afghanistan again, causing unbelievable bloodshed. In order to prevent this from happening, we must ask the question, how did the U.S. lose Afghanistan to extremists in the first place? In 1989, when the Soviets crossed back over their border, the Afghan story disappeared from the media's radar. The Cold War was over and the U.S. had won. Journalists packed their bags and left while the people of Afghanistan had to deal with the blowback from the largest covert CIA operation since Vietnam. As far back as 1981, Jay Petersell raised the question of how the media was covering this story in the Columbia Journalism Review. Today, many hard questions are not being asked. Among them is whether the U.S. wants the Soviets out of Afghanistan or prefer to make the country Russia's Vietnam. In that case, the Afghans are paying a heavy price for the global balance of power. In a 2001 Times of India article, Selig Harrison said he was told by CIA leaders in the 1980s that they encouraged the most fanatical Islamists from around the world to come to Afghanistan to fight the Soviets. The article that Selig Harrison was in was 2001, was a little late for the Afghan people to avoid another decade of slaughter. Afghanistan was lost one day at a time over 23 years of conflict. 2 million lay dead, 12 million women are living in abject poverty, and 1 million are handicapped from landmine explosions. But prior to the Soviet invasion, Afghanistan had a modern history as a moderate Islamic state that enshrined women's rights in their 1964 constitution. In the early 1970s, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar was driven out of Afghanistan for extremism. His followers threw acid in the face of women who did not wear the chadori. He found safe haven in Pakistan, from where the Taliban emerged to take over Afghanistan in 1996. He received the largest supplies of weapons and money from the United States during the Soviet occupation. Now Hekmatyar is returning with remnants of the al-Qaeda and Taliban mentality to terrorize the Afghans once again. Today, a majority of Afghans consider Hekmatyar a war criminal who killed thousands of Afghan civilians during the 1990 Civil War. Yet he roams free. Instead of helping the Afghans decommission these warlords empowered during the Soviet occupation, the Pentagon has renamed many of them regional leaders and pays them for their favors. Nobody can figure out why the roads aren't getting fixed or the electrical generating facilities aren't brought back online, but warlords are getting richer. There are also serious schisms inside the U.S. presence. Even though 2/3 of the Loya Jirga wanted the king to be head of state, President Bush's special envoy to Kabul, Zolmay Khalilzad, got the king to sign a document under duress that prevents him from acting as head of state. Karzai is proving to be powerless without the king behind him. But despite these hardships, life seems to thrive in and around the city. The Afghans are irrepressible and determined to rebuild. These resilient people know that what they need to bring stability to their own country, if in fact the United States was serious about stabilizing Afghanistan, it could happen overnight. Afghans would create a modern Islamic democracy that would inspire the world. But without the media covering this story until the job is done, the American public will be denied the chance to help the Afghans get their country back again, a small repayment for the sacrifice they made to help the U.S. win the Cold War. But it wasn't until we arrived in our hometown of Boston we realized how much we have already lost by deserting the Afghan people in the first place. After 18 days on the road, we had everything on tape we needed. "What were you doing in Kabul?" the customs agent asked us as he flips through our passport. "Do you have any military footage?" We answer quickly that wasn't our purpose. Now we're hoping he won't try to confiscate all 18 hours to check. We know our rights, but we don't want to have to make an issue of it. He excuses himself to confer with his superiors. As we stare across the room, we are reminded that this wasn't the first time we were challenged as journalists on Afghanistan. Our last day in Kabul in 1983 was spent protecting our tapes from the Afghan censor whose job was to blacken Soviet military images. Now a U.S. customs agent decides it's his job to question what images we can bring back to Americans, an act that is clearly unconstitutional, yet intimidating. At least in 1983, the Marxist bureaucrat was the official censor, and we as Americans used our belief in the freedom of the press to challenge his authority. The customs agent backed off, as did the Afghan censor, but this reminded us that 9/11 changed how the press functions. The concept of a free press that we used to convince the Afghan censor to back off in 1983 is threatened. As we witnessed Afghans trying to raise their standard of journalism to meet the Western model, we wondered, what has the American press become, and how far can we go along this path before we lose everything we cherish, not just as journalists, but as Americans? We would now like to present the Voices of Afghanistan.
I am apprehensive, and I know I'll be devastated by the destruction that I know it will hit me very hard, but I'm also hopeful that I will be able to help those that are returning back to Afghanistan, especially the women who are trying to rebuild a devastated country and really rebuild the lives of the Afghan people.
Good.
He was showing us his home, and he said he had undergone some serious traumatic events. I mean, when Gould was shelling the city about 7-8 years ago, they actually had this. They were having a funeral and had to bring the mullah to say the last rites for this young child who had been killed in the shellings. And the shelling started getting heavier, and they had to immediately, they had to dig a grave, and there were 3 men who had to hide in the grave. And he was talking in this area that he was showing us, basically, there were 2, a mother and a daughter that was seriously hurt, and they were bleeding, and how he took them and had to risk his life to take them to the hospital. And he said that many of his relatives who had sought refuge in Islamabad were asking him, pleading with him to come and leave the city because of the dangers. And he said he never left the city, and the sights and that he witnessed were horrific. He will never forget what he witnessed during those times.
I was really fortunate to arrive in the war here at a time when the jihad against the Soviets was relatively uncorrupted, in that the Mujahideen had very poor weapons. I mean, it's a sad thing to say, but it's a very romantic. People were on foot or on horseback with old rifles, and the massive plundering of money from the U.S. and Pakistan and so on hadn't started yet. There were several reporters over here who specialized in reporting on the Mujahideen from the very conservative point of view, who faked footage and fake news footage and stuff like this, and so they got a huge marquee for their work. They're people who had that market sewed up. So if you were actually trying to do something real and cover these things, it was somewhat harder. So there had been this kind of consciousness on the part of reporters that was fed to the American people as kind of a post-New Deal or Rooseveltian ideal, Wilsonian, Rooseveltian, and that's all gone now. So now people are taught this very cynical view of the world by journalists.
My name is Abdullah Sherzai. I'm a neurologist. The reason I'm here is because I thought this was a great opportunity to further my education, not as an academic neurologist, but as a human being.
I learned English in a bad situation, in Taliban situation. in Taliban regime, I started to learn English, and on that time it was so difficult for us to learn English, and we learned English by a special teacher that he came to our house and we learned English. On that,
was a man?
Yeah, he was a man, and he was so afraid that if the Taliban had known about our studying, they would, dot.
I was in Bosnia also several times, and if you compare Bosnia to Afghanistan, I think in the last 7 months here in Afghanistan has been more rebuilding, reconstruction than in the last 7 years in Bosnia.
We're going to visit the orphanage where the young kids are, and then he's going to identify a few children who have absolutely no parents and who are desperately in need. They're going to sing a song for us.
I needed to see this because what I'm doing, trying to help those that are trying to help rebuild Afghanistan, but I cannot forget this, and I needed to accept the reality of my country. It's not just what I see, the positivity, the people have a lot of hope, and we are trying to rebuild, but we also have this destruction, and it's our responsibility to build from here.
In terms of journalism, myself, I feel a responsibility. Ironically, I'm doing this for a fashion magazine, but I feel a responsibility because there's a great deal of ignorance in the United States. It seems like everyone thinks of Afghanistan as a hot zone, and there's still, even though we have a huge humanitarian machine going on, it doesn't seem that I see any when we go, especially on the western side, which has been completely demolished, any type of visible signs of reconstruction.
Starting to think that there is still a lot more hills to be climbed in Afghanistan before it's going to be in a place that it's going to be safe, and if it does take a turn for the worse, a fairly paltry number of U.S. and coalition forces that are here are not going to be able to do very much, except try to save their own skins. So I think people aren't dealing with some of the important issues, but and one of the reasons is because they're complicated, and in a lot of ways, and the American public has not been really educated in such a way in the last generation or so to really start understanding some of these nuances. And so things get oversimplified. The women's issues, the burqa, and all that, things get oversimplified. The status of the country, the terrorists. Half of the Taliban is running around still in the country and is back to farming or whatever. Do you prosecute? Do you send them to The Hague for war crimes, or do you just let them get back on with their lives? All these kind of issues are difficult to understand even from an American point of view, and I think that makes it hard to really convey what's going on here, and to really somehow report from here in ways that really make people back in the States understand in a good way what's happening.
A year and a month ago, I don't think we'd ever had a reporter in Afghanistan. Part of that was because it wasn't possible under the Taliban. They weren't letting U.S. reporters in very often. But also, it wasn't on the radar, frankly. The only time we'd mentioned Afghanistan in the paper at all was those rare occasions, such as when President Clinton ordered a missile strike here. It's hard to sort things out, and journalism kind of demands you write things simply and clearly, and things aren't simple and clear. So it's very hard.
We must support these community grassroots leadership in a new democracy in Afghanistan, because we need to keep the balance in a new emerging democracy between the powerful political institutions and the civil society institutions. A democracy, a successful democracy, is about maintaining that balance. And if the West wants to help Afghanistan and help the Afghan people, we must keep this balance in mind. And we are We must commit to help rebuild the community grassroots leadership. This is the group of women and men who work across ethnicity, who work across gender, who are nonpartisan, and who work across sectarian lines. This is the Afghanistan that we have never heard of. We have heard constantly about the extreme right and the extreme left, but the wider cadre of the Afghan society, which originates from this philosophy and have this viewpoint, we do not hear about them. So therefore, in the West, when the voices of the Afghan people are portrayed, it's portrayed in the extreme, and there are many misperceptions that we must rectify in order to bring a real understanding of Afghanistan, and this understanding is imperative to any development and assistance programs. And I feel this is where the media can play an important role. It must seek out the Afghan women and men who are non-politically motivated, who are about rebuilding their own societies, who have committed throughout the process of the 23 years of war to work to serve their people.
Paul or Liz, will you comment on what we've seen?
Yeah, that was just a very brief clip of some of the things, the people that we met very close to where we were staying. There's a lot of things going on. Seema is someone we have been working with now for a number of years, just to try to raise consciousness about the issue of Afghanistan. I mean, we didn't intend Afghanistan to become a life's work, but after 1981, Afghanistan does have some kind of magical quality. It's almost the fellow there that you saw in the video who was talking about he was trying to become a better human being by going to Afghanistan. I mean, he really wasn't kidding. We had lots of discussions with him about Zarathustra's library was in Afghanistan. He came up with the very concept of the idea of the war of the light and the dark, good versus evil, some very basic concepts that are filtered into Western civilization, into Indo-European culture that we don't even think about any longer, but we're indigenous to the Indus Valley, we're indigenous to Afghanistan. And that is something that it is intoxicating. Talking to the fellow there from Getty Images, who he had his flak jacket. I saw him hanging out in the hall, he had his flak jacket. I said, can I talk to you about what you're doing? And he'd been at Tora Bora, he'd been through the whole thing, as well as the USA. Steve Camaro had been at Tora Bora. And they both admitted when they got to Afghanistan they knew absolutely nothing about it. Nothing prepared them for it any more than we were prepared for it in 1981. But there is some kind of magnetic attraction to that place that is so fascinating, and the people are so dynamic. The individual rebuilding is absolutely astonishing that's going on there right now. Individuals, people are coming back from the United States, from Europe, and they're building their homes and whatever. But in terms of public infrastructure, virtually nothing is happening in Afghanistan, despite promises. So this is just a brief. I know I don't want to take away from Mr. Zelnick's time, but I could have made a 6-hour documentary just on our trip.
Probably been worth it.
Bob Zelnick can wait just a minute. We're not crowding. We're not taking anything from him. I want you to. There's a lot that is completely unclear to me yet, Paul and Liz, from these pictures and your account. What is it you want us to know about what's been happening to Afghanistan under American policy for 20 years now?
Okay, well, a lot of what Seema was looking at was she was one of the signers of the Bonn Agreement, which brought the new government back into Afghanistan last December. She was one of the 2 females or 3 females that were involved in it.
How did she come to do that?
She is a relative of the king. She was the first refugee from the coup in 1978.
It's also 20 years of work as a human rights activist. At this point, her work is focusing a lot on Afghanistan, but she's really been doing this kind of work, and it's recognized. Her work with indigenous organizations, and in fact, her work the 2 weeks we were there was to go and talk to the local NGOs, women-led, that had, many of whom had actually maintained their operations during the Taliban era under great risk to their lives. These organizations maintain the basic civil society level of existence with little to no funding, with little to no access to international funding.
But I'm still looking for the big picture on this, of the American interest in this space between India and the Russians. Give us day one and then a sense of what's been happening.
Well, it's very hard to determine exactly what the Western position is at this point. And it's obvious that Afghanistan has enormous geopolitical interests, importance rather. The United States, to lose Afghanistan would be at this point comparable to losing China back in the late 1940s. It is a pivot. It's a central point between. It's a point on the old Silk Road.
Forgive me, Paul. I don't mean to interrupt you, but there's no comparison at all. China is a nation of 1.5 billion people. Afghanistan is a pile of rocks, basically, with handfuls of tribes that
It's,
make it. Why do you compare it to China?
Well, in terms of its importance, I would say right at the moment, as we know, the world is in a great state of flux, particularly the Arab world. The situation with oil, there is oil coming, pipelines across northern Afghanistan are vital to the economies, the future economies for the next 100 years of India, Pakistan, and even China, the industrial base of China. All these things have to go through Afghanistan. One of the people that we ran into told us that Afghanistan is kind of the belly button of Asia. Everything has to come and go through Afghanistan. A peaceful, secure Afghanistan was exactly what the United States wanted back in the 1950s. In fact, at one point, Afghanistan made overtures back in the 1950s towards the United States. They wanted a closer relationship. And the Dulles brothers insisted that that was very dangerous because they didn't want to threaten the stability of Afghanistan. And if they saw, if the Russians saw us moving more closely to Afghanistan, that would disturb them very much. So the actual opposite of that position was taken in the late 1970s, beginning around 1973, with a coup that overthrew the king and exiled him to Italy. But at which point the great game was resumed, so to speak, on an intelligence basis. And some of the more radical fundamentalists, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar specifically at that time, was the process of building his army began.
Were we there for the oil?
Very much so. I think we're there for the oil. We're there for the strategic importance of being there. China believes that it should have a hegemony over South Asia, Southeast Asia, and that part of the world. And so for military purposes, that's also a big issue. Also, Iran is right next door. Herat is one of the cities that is a big city in question right now. The United States has a big presence in Herat, and there's a lot of controversy over the warlord who is now leading the city of Herat.
Let me ask you, and we'll get to Bob in a moment, but what was the connection between the bombing war in Afghanistan and the search for the perpetrators of 9/11? In your view?
Well, what was the connection between the two?
What led to what here? What are the logical links?
Well, I mean, it's a very complex situation, and that's part of the groundwork that you have to understand is that the United States has had Pakistan as an ally since the end of World War II. The British pretty much turned Pakistan over to the United States as an ally, and I believe up until recently Pakistan was very close to Britain. It still is in many ways. So what we have there is the United States back in the early 1980s decided to use Pakistan to destabilize Afghanistan. There was a division inside the American government during the 1970s that few people are really aware of, but there was this a report that was put out in 1976 called the Team B report, at which point a group of very, very conservative individuals who had been in the government previously, some were at that time in academia, decided to attack the CIA's estimates of what the Soviet Union was up to. And that really was the heart of, was following the Vietnam War. A lot of people were disillusioned about the processes and the attitudes that were going on. And as a result of that, you had a very disaffected group of people who wanted to get even with the Soviet Union for what was done to us in Vietnam and the humiliation that was suffered. It may sound like almost a trite way of saying, well, they wanted that you don't do global actions based on that. But in this particular case, it was a real motivation. And sitting there talking with Rob, the Time correspondent, about his motivations back then, and there's a lot of footage where he says, there was an overwhelming desire to just simply get the Russians for what they were doing in Afghanistan. And so that kind of became a snowball. The fact is that Afghanistan is not an easy place to get to, even today. It was not an easy place to get to then. It's not the kind of place you just happen to drop by. And as a result of that, a lot of very questionable activity, very questionable activity occurred in terms of funding, in terms of organizations. A lot of fundamentalists, conservative fundamentalists from the Arab world were essentially paid to go to Afghanistan. They were trained there. This was not of Afghan origin. This was of Arab origin. This was a very different process. Indigenous Afghan culture is very different from what produced 9/11. That was not an Afghan adventure. That was a fundamentalist Arab adventure. Actually, we heard for many years that Afghanistan, northern Afghanistan, particularly where the pipeline was going, was being colonized by the Arabs.
Well, I want to bring Bob into it, but maybe if we ask you a question first, or do you want to speak first?
I'm perfectly delighted to answer a question. Well, I want to attempt to.
My question, immediately after 9/11, before any military response was clear, it just struck me that there were probably more people inside 495 who knew the phone codes, the bank procedures, the inner dynamics of that attack than there were in all of Afghanistan. But certainly if you add the New York metropolitan area, Florida, and Hamburg, and a few in Paris perhaps, there were more 9/11 villains here in the West, in the United States, than in all of Afghanistan. How, in your view, Bob, as a military matter, as a political matter, did Afghanistan become the target for the American vengeance after 9/11? Was it right? Was it logical? Of course, Osama bin Laden was supposed to be there, and the Taliban was taunting us. But how did we make that leap?
I think it was perfectly logical, whether you would agree with it as a matter of policy or not. The administration decided that 9/11 brought home the threat of terrorism to the United States as nothing else had, although there had been many warnings, and decided to embark on a war against terrorism. And one of the elements of that war, one of the first elements that was articulated by the president, was that states which harbor terrorists will be treated as though they were themselves terrorists. Afghanistan, unfortunately, became the object of our immediate wrath, but it's interesting, and I think it clearly shows where the administration thinking was, that you'll remember when the president first addressed this issue, he told the Taliban that if you deliver al-Qaeda, if you deliver bin Laden, then we're not going to interfere in your country. What we wanted was the Taliban bases closed, and the al-Qaeda bases closed, and the al-Qaeda ringleaders delivered to Western justice, to the United States, and we were perfectly content, at least for the time being, to see the country remain in the grip of this awful regime. When the Taliban, apparently after some contemplation and some internal discussion, decided against moving in the direction the president demanded, and it was a demand articulated as a non-negotiable demand, then this was step one in the war on terrorism. Iraq is apparently shaping up as step two in the war on terrorism. as the administration has defined it, and is intending to fight it. But I don't.
Remind us of those connections, logical or otherwise. Why is Iraq step 2 in the war on terrorism?
Because the administration has regarded it as potentially the most mischievous nation in that area, and when you combine that with the weapons of mass destruction that Iraq has been working on.
But now we're speaking of terrorism. What's the terror or the 9/11 connection? Do we suppose?
I think the administration is of two minds on this. In the simplest approach, they feel that the war on terrorism cannot be won if the war on the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction is lost, and Iraq presents itself as a particularly venal actor in that area. I think that's the narrow approach that the administration is taking. There are those in the administration, the Paul Wolfowitzes and others of his thinking, who believe that there's an opportunity to do even more, that if you go in and remove this brutal dictator and bad actor, you can help transform the region. You can implant democracy in Iraq, and that will prove contagious and perhaps make the Arab world move in the direction that the communist world moved in the late 1980s. Again, I'm not endorsing at this forum one way of thinking or the other. I don't think it's my role to do that here. But I think that probably gets fairly close to what is being reasoned at different places in the administration.
Bob Zelnick, part of the mandate tonight is to talk about the coverage of the Afghan war and Afghanistan as a kind of exercise in what we know and how we know it and who tells us. It reminds me of Harold Isaacs, the late marvelous journalist and reporter on journalism, but he did a couple of books in which the subtext was scratches on our minds about the Arab world, for example. But in this case, I'd like you to give us your quick take on, and Liz and Paul too perhaps, the scratches on our mind about Afghanistan. What is it we're supposed to know? Who is it that wants us to know it that way? And how, start with you, Bob, what did the coverage of the war in Afghanistan tell you about the modern practice of American journalism?
Well, the first thing it told me in its early stages was that the conflict between the media and the military, which grew out of the Vietnam War, which those of us who had any role in covering found a very open type of place. It was a very easy war to cover. There were no restrictions on travel. You could get anywhere you wanted on military aircraft. There was no censorship of any kind, simply general rules that you don't compromise operations. But a very deep bitterness developed between the military and the press in Vietnam. I think to some extent there were those in the military who felt that the jaundiced press coverage inhibited the administrations involved from providing the military with the options they needed to win the war. And even those members of the military who didn't go that far believed, particularly in the closing years of the war, that the press was not only skeptical, but was out to devalue the military, was out to embarrass the military, was reporting on racial conflict within the military, on the use of drugs, on the failure of the military units to follow orders. And there was a great social, cultural gulf between the press and the military, which has been reflected in how the military has treated the press in every single conflict since then, beginning with the invasion of Grenada, where reporters were kept aboard a ship, an aircraft carrier, not allowed to go ashore until the war was nearly over. I had a colleague, Steve Shepard, at ABC, who actually rented a small boat and tried to go to Grenada, and the military sent A-6 aircraft overhead and dropped canisters in the line that he was sailing, and of course aborted that effort entirely. There were, I don't want to make this a history of the military and the media, but there were commissions that were formed afterwards. By the Pentagon and the media working together, they formulated principles and policies that were supposed to obviate this kind of situation in the future. They formed, for example, a permanent press pool at the Pentagon that was ready to go at a moment's notice. Well, the first test of that came in Panama, where they were shepherded down to Panama 3 or 4 hours after the conflict began. They were sequestered at an air base miles from the conflict, kept there virtually incommunicado, or at least not permitted to leave the base for 3 days, were given briefings by a deputy chief of mission at the U.S. Embassy, or even a lower-level press officer, and kept from the fighting entirely. And we saw this recur in the Persian Gulf War. There were all kinds of restrictions. And then we come to Afghanistan, and again, all of these conflicts were followed by periods when the press and the Pentagon met, negotiated, reached agreement on certain principles of open coverage, and it was violated in practice time and again by the military. In Afghanistan, in the early days of the conflict, the press was denied access to the ships and bases that served as launching point for operations. They were denied access to some of the countries surrounding Afghanistan, where the U.S. formed alliances enabling them to mobilize their military. They were denied access to several of the important units involved, particularly the special forces. When incidents happened, for example, when the Marines lost several men killed and wounded in friendly fire and were returning from the scene of the action from which the press had been barred initially, but the press was waiting at the base, they were herded into a canister, literally a shipping container, and basically padlocked in there, so they had no access to the Marines who were returning from combat, and could have told them what went on. These kinds of incidents happened time and again in the early phases of the war. I think the press acted heroically. They moved with troops from the Northern Alliance. They were, on some occasions, even guests of the Taliban. They were able to report on civilian damage in Kabul. They were able to make their way even into Kandahar, which was the last major city controlled by the Taliban. There was more than a dozen reporters killed and wounded in the early days of this conflict. And I think the press was trying to do its best and did its best in covering a very difficult and shady war under the most difficult and dangerous of circumstances. There came a time around December of 2001 when a combination of complaints and enlightened self-interest on the part of the administration and the military caused policy to change somewhat. For example, veteran correspondents like Jack McQuethy of ABC and David Martin of CBS were invited over to Afghanistan, and they were, as the term went, embedded with the special forces. I always love the term embedded. It kind of makes me think of the Harvard Business Review. But the press was given greater access to, for example, the 82nd Airborne Division. They were permitted to see and interviewed troops. They were brought to some of the operations. I forget the name of the big one, Anaconda, only a day or so after the action began. So things improved on a technical level, but I think reporters now, and I've talked to, in preparation for this gathering and others, I've talked to a number of foreign editors and a number of recently returned journalists from the area. Some interesting things. There has not been an engagement, military engagement in Afghanistan for a period of 30 days now. The reporters who are over there have no idea why not. They have no idea what the thinking is on the part of Americans. They have no idea what powers and responsibilities have been delegated to allied troops in the area. There's not been a single suspected al-Qaeda person detained for 30 days. And that seems to be in derogation of one of the basic missions of the troops over there. But the order to maintain silence, which came from the Pentagon to the military that's posted there, is so severe that even the most senior and able correspondents in the field are having trouble putting it together. And despite all that, despite what has been a pervasive effort at information control by the administration and its military agents, I have seen, and of course, a diminution in the number of reporters and the number of organizations that are even represented there on a continuing basis. You still see some interesting and excellent reports in the major dailies. You've seen reports about
Excuse me, Bob. Was the presumption that this was all pre-election, sort of put the quietus on the story of conflict until the election was over, or not? What is the?
I don't think so. I think this is. I think the same thing is shaping up in Iraq if and when we go to war there. Now, I do know that several major news organizations have been contacted by the Pentagon in recent days and told to provide a list of correspondents that they want to see embedded with the fighting units over there. ABC News has provided some names. The Washington Post, I'm told, provided a list of 20 names to the Pentagon, and all were accepted by the Pentagon. They're going to go to places like Fort Bragg and Pendleton and actually train for 3 to 5 days so that the military is convinced they're physically fit enough so they won't have to be distracted if they on some operation. But there are many, many questions about future operations that remain to be defined, and many about Afghanistan that we can't get at.
I'm glad to hear you make the sort of the general comparison with Vietnam, when, as you say, reporters had a relatively free reign, and the most famous of them, like David Halberstam, Neil Sheehan, Malcolm Brown, and others, were, in one fashion or another, dissenters. And Walter Cronkite, famously, in his report to the American people, undid Lyndon Johnson's war, so Lyndon Johnson felt. So that the press was activist in a way, and free, and extremely significant in the presentation. What is to be done? What are the big news agencies doing, the networks and the papers, to regain some of that independence of thinking and narrative in a situation like this?
I'm not sure that the press has sacrificed its independence of thinking. In fact, in the early days of the Afghan campaign, there was a good deal of critical writing right from the front about the tactics that were being used and the lack of coordination between air power, for example, and spotters on the ground. I think that people today over there are raising questions about the wisdom of the U.S. Not trying to extend its control physical control much beyond Kabul, about the deals that are being made with the various warlords, about the resurgent growth and cultivation of the poppy plants. The heroin industry seems to be staging a major comeback. There have been reports of even the Taliban reasserting itself in certain limited areas of the country now. There have been reports in recent days of local warlords imposing a regime that is as dictatorial and oppressive as the Taliban was. In answer to the question that you folks raised, I don't have a tremendous amount of difficulty defining how the U.S. views Afghanistan and what its objectives are. After the Soviet invasion of the country, Afghanistan became a pawn in the Cold War. We had no particular interest in the fate of the Afghan people other than we wanted to use them as tools to hurt, embarrass, and humiliate the invading Soviets and to drive them out of the country. Well, it was one of many, many places where, in the Third World, where these kinds of actions and interactions occurred. I suspect that if you really got to the core of it, right today, there's not a tremendous amount of interest as to what happens with Afghanistan so long as it doesn't become a base for terrorism again. We're not there for humanitarian reasons. We're there because Afghanistan was, as configured, a threat to us, and a very serious threat to us, as we saw. So, again, I'm not here as an advocate or a dissenter from the administration policy, but I think it's pretty clear that whether we don't want to put all our marbles in saving Afghanistan, or whether we don't want to become another occupying power and trigger a backlash among the Afghan people, whatever it is, we have rather limited political objectives there, but important security objectives.
Paul and Liz, you want to respond to that point? But please also continue on the general theme of the mainstream coverage of this war in the American media.
Well, I don't think that we can maintain our geostrategic interests there without a political involvement. That would be the first thing that strikes you is that there's a vast amount of destruction that's happened, and the most recent being from the U.S. But in addition to that, there's some very simple things that could be done, and were promised by the administration. And it seems at this point it's sinking into the Afghan people that they were led, first of all, they were led into fighting the Russians and dying in order to support American interests. And now, once again, they've been led to believe, as an example, some of the money that's coming in, I think this $350 million that's been pledged by, at least released by the Bush administration. And half of that money is going to basically fortify the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, which, for all intents and purposes, is an absurd representation of Fort Apache. I hate to say it, I mean, in this day and age, to have to rely in a place like Afghanistan with all the satellites and laser beams and various kinds of biotechnological weapons to look at basically what looks like a 19th or perhaps even 13th century Irish fort is really kind of absurd when you see it. And it's when you're looking at people inside the embassy that are basically armed at all times with their fingers on the triggers. When you're walking around Kabul sitting down at restaurants and you're greeted by 15 Special Forces people whose fingers are on their triggers, one hand on the kebab and the other hand on the trigger, you begin to wonder exactly, wouldn't it be a little easier if we tried to help these people establish rebuild some roads, maybe get these people working, rebuild the electrical facilities, which you have power for about 6 hours a day, get these people in that kind of mode, and we might get these people on our side. I think they've shown us what they can be hospitable to the Taliban, and they can be hospitable to Al-Qaeda. We want to make them hospitable to ourselves, and there just seems to be an attitude of non-compliance, particularly with the 82nd Airborne. They're going in and rousting villages and making villagers sit outside their villages for 24 hours as punishment for having a cache of weapons, which came over the border from Pakistan, which were purchased with Saudi and American money. I mean, there's an absurdity to the approach that you can only see when you get into Afghanistan itself.
And do you feel that the press has been vetting this to?
I think the press has been doing a very good job in terms of their ability to tell that story. Unfortunately, the focus is now off Afghanistan. The focus is now gone to Iraq.
This is the major point that we feel really has to come home. When we do hear talk about regime change in Iraq, we really have to recognize that we've already had regime change in Afghanistan. So we really feel that that is a very simple, very direct challenge to the Bush administration. Let's prove the policy works. Let's first take care of Afghanistan. Let's create that democracy. What we saw very much led us to believe that the United States could do a lot more in the simplest ways. And it's not just an issue of more money in and of itself. It's an issue of accepting the fact that in terms of the responsibility that we have to the Afghan people, which does go back to the fact that decision-making did impact the Afghan people, did impact the eventual rise of the Taliban, that there were opportunities going back. In fact, one of the quotes that I'm reminded of was, this was Special Envoy Peter Thompson in 1992 sent a memo to his superiors and to the then President Bush, stating that with a little cost we could maintain a very moderate Afghanistan and reduce extremism. This is in 1992. So we already knew that there was extremism. We already knew that there was a moderate Afghan population that should be helped.
But Liz, wait a second now. Bob has already told us, if we didn't know, that this is not a humanitarian mission, that we have no fundamental interest in the Afghan people now or ever. I frankly wonder, I mean, can we have it both ways? I wanted to ask Bob, I mean, there was so much coverage on the way in of what the United States was going to do for the women's movement in Afghanistan, and I must say, that's when I reach for my gun and I say, please. I mean, that's the silliest rationale for a war that I've ever heard. And yet we do. I mean, Liz is still thinking we ought to go in there, be nice, because they were nice enough to unravel the Soviet Union for us. We talk out of both sides of our mouth, and the press especially, on what the hell we're doing there. Is it a pawn in the Cold War? Is it the axis of oil pipelines for the 21st century, or are we out there being Boy Scouts helping nice little old women out of their masks and across the street?
We're always pleased to help women out of their masks, but I didn't interpret the coverage precisely the way you're articulating it. I never was.
It became a sort of a Gloria Steinem rally.
I understand. I never felt from the coverage that we were over there as kind of an extension of women's liberation. I thought it was very interesting to come into Kabul, to see the reports from Kabul during the first days of the city's liberation from the Taliban, and to see the outpouring of women who felt that they had been freed from some terribly oppressive presence. I think it was an eye-opening experience for those who had forgotten just how repressive an extremist Islamic State can be. But it never commended itself to me from any of the reporting that I saw or read that this was the primary purpose of our mission to Afghanistan. It seemed to me that the primary purpose was to catch and disrupt as many al-Qaeda people and activities as we possibly could, and to wipe out the Taliban, who had turned down the ultimatum of the president to deliver al-Qaeda or face the consequences.
1-800, all that stuff. It's time for the callers. It's time for everybody in the room to feel entitled. We're all sitting around one great big dinner table here, and we'd love to hear your angles. We're talking about Afghanistan and the coverage of it. There's a microphone here, as Tom said, and we'd love to open it wide up. Would you like to come to the mic? Thank you.
When I travel overseas to Europe and to India, I get channels besides CNN like BBC, Star News, and so on. And what I can find there when I flip through them is a real diversity of opinions and perspective on any event that happens, whether it be Afghanistan or even others. When I come back to the States, I'm always amazed at how uniform the coverage is in all the channels. You flip through here, you hear the same story over again. It's a typically sanitized version, too. So I wonder, where is our the freedom of press that we talk about? It's not the government that's censoring it, I will say. Maybe it's a censorship of the market. You can't, state the truth and sell Coke at the same time.
I find it very interesting, just having been outside the major media during this time period and working freelance with the big institutions, with CBS and with ABC and with CNN. And I find it very interesting that we encountered a lot of, from CBS particularly, the accusation that what I saw the first time that we went to Afghanistan was sanitized. It was a sanitized version of what was going on because of the control that was put on. And that was a big issue back in 1981. Could you get an accurate view of what the communist Marxist government was trying to accomplish in Afghanistan, and were the Russians really doing the fighting, or were the Afghans doing it, how much was going on, that sort of thing. And ironically, here being greeted by this customs official at Logan Airport who could care less what was in my bags. I've just come from a place that produces 75% of the heroin in the world market, and he could have cared less about what was in those bags. All he cared about what was on my videotape. Now, I was in transit for 2.5 days.
Well, I don't think you're answering the gentleman's question about why the American line is so pervasive. And a line, sort of like birds off a wire, is so general in our media on all the networks and the big papers and the wire services. The line comes down.
Bob would probably be a better person to answer that question than I am.
I don't completely share the assumption. I think, for example...
I think I do, for what it's worth.
Well, okay. I think if you were to review the coverage, both print and electronic, of the build-up toward war in Iraq, you would see great diversity on the
I disagree, Bob.
You don't see it?
No, a surfer has to, you have to go to the Guardian and the Independent and in England first for English speakers or English readers to hear any sense of, get any feeling of ferment. In my own experience, what's yours?
Yes, I think there's a distinction between the print and the TV too. On TV, it's completely monitored.
Absolutely.
I think wait a second. You have had a parade of people on the cable news networks disputing the administration's march toward war in Iraq. You've had any number of pieces in the Boston Globe, in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, disputing and raising questions about administration assumptions regarding, for example, the link between Iraq and al-Qaeda. Now, I
disagree. You hear endless chewing over the question of whether there was a meeting in Vienna, and who was there, and who's got the record, and whatnot. I don't think you hear a very lively argument about the wisdom of this thing. And I mean, I want to be a little provocative, but to me, it all began within days of 9/11, and when it hit me in the face was with God, I'm blocking his name now just because I'm annoyed with him. Imus in the morning. I mean, Imus on the eve of the 2000 election said, "Hey, let's go with Bush. Come on, he'll be more fun. We'll have more jokes. He'll be easier to diddle and fiddle with and play with." I mean, it was just the most. He was just a butt of that kind of humor. And within days of 9/11, he was saying, why is it that just history seems to present us with these giants in moments of crisis? We had Roosevelt in the Depression, Lincoln in the Civil War, and now we've got George W. Bush. And he was saying with a straight face, I think we've had sort of like, hold tight, we're going to follow this former pinhead into war, regardless. I think, I mean, seriously, he was Alfred E. Newman one day, and he was Winston Churchill the next.
Well, I have the singular advantage in this, and not being a listener of Imus, but I do think that the event of 9/11 was such a catastrophe and such a national trauma that there was a normal, totally understandable tendency on the part of the country, number one, to look for leadership from the President of the United States, and the fact that he responded in those early days with previously unexhibited eloquence and a sense of compassion, I think, and a sense of determination was the appropriate response to what the nation desperately sought in those days. If I haven't been seeing and listening to dissenting opinions on the march toward war in Iraq, then I don't know what I've been hearing. But I saw the New York Times report day after day about the difficulty of urban warfare, about the differences between the 1991 war and fighting in Iraq today.
One always does get the feeling that it's almost like reporting from a theme park. I mean, no matter what happens, it never changes the course of the direction of the political debate. And this has happened, I mean, so much within American history. I mean, and it happens every 20 years, just in time for another cycle of military development. And I'm sure it's coincidental, but there is a natural process at work here that seems to give you the feeling that the real issue never gets discussed, and that we do have this kind of theme park approach to it that says, well, what are they doing today, and what are we doing today? And there's a gentleman's agreement that it works that way. It seems to me.
Hi, I have a question about how reporters get information, and I'm going to give you a story that I believe is a true story told to me in Boston by a professor here. He was at the end of the Gulf War. He was a participant to the negotiations at the end of the Gulf War, and at those negotiations, a decision was made not to kill Saddam Hussein. And in response to that decision, and there was pressure brought to bear on the United States to come to this decision, we would be allowed to put military in Saudi Arabia. And in return, we would not touch Saddam Hussein. So question number one is, I never saw that reported in the papers. Question number two is, why is the situation now different from what it was at the Gulf War time, that we now can go in and kill Saddam Hussein? And question number three is, in regards to Afghanistan and the coverage of that war, is I believe there was a lot more to the story, which has been intimated here. I believe oil had a lot to do with the story. I believe a pipeline from Uzbekistan and Tajikistan had a lot to do with the story. I believe that heroin had a lot to do with the story. And in all the coverage I saw of that particular war, those pieces were never put together for me. So why was that?
Let me take a crack at least the first part of it. I think in terms of trying to kill Saddam Hussein, during the war itself, and I reported this afterwards, there were several efforts to kill him by locating where he was and hitting him with these deep excavation bombs, because the assumption was that if he was at a particular place, he was underground in some well-bunkered location. As the war ended, and I'm not privy to the story that you're talking about, but it was pretty clear two things. First of all, the best intelligence that the president was getting was that they expected Saddam to fall and be removed by the military because of the disastrous war he had gotten them into, and that the military itself would pick somebody to run the country, which was just fine with us. It was exactly what we wanted, exactly what the Saudis wanted, because they wanted they wanted Iraq as a bulwark against Iran in the region, and we were happier if there was a division of power rather than a single nation. And the feeling was that Iraq would break into at least three different pieces: Sunni, Kurd, and Shiite, if things were allowed, if we aided or participated in any campaign to get rid of Saddam. So just as we were persuaded before he moved against Kuwait that he was a guy we could live with, and that was a serious misjudgment, number one, on the part of George Bush and his administration, I think there was a feeling afterward that since we had not eliminated him during the war, it was better for us to stay out and let the generals do it in Baghdad.
Good answer. Excuse me. Please.
Hi, my name is Susan Scher. I'm president of the Fort Hall Forum, so welcome. Thank you very much for coming. My day job, by the way, Chris, I think that although I'm pretty much anti-war, going in to protect women and children is maybe a little bit better than just doing it for the oil. So, at any rate, in my day job, I run a national women's peace organization, which is WAND, Women's Action for New Directions, which used to be Women's Action for Nuclear Disarmament. And right now we're all about anti-war in Iraq. But about 5 years ago, I personally stopped listening to any news or watching it on television and only listening to it on the radio and BBC and NPR and getting my news from the internet and listservs. I read the headlines in the Globe and the New York Times, and then when people send me articles on specific issues over email, I read them. But to be informed in my work, which is all about the Pentagon and military spending and about foreign policy, I'm not going to get it from the journalists on television. And I'd like to hear some...
I agree with that.
Yeah.
No,
that's an easy answer.
Certainly never got it from me when I was on television.
But as somebody who was at the Pentagon, and now in this last year or so with the Pentagon reporters, and even prior to that with people saying that they're not getting real news, why would anyone bother to listen to them? They're not allowed to ask hard questions.
Well, fewer people are watching the major networks, and in saying before that I was not personally aware of a monolithic point of view on the part of the press, I don't for a moment suggest that the three networks with their news programs and their withdrawal from foreign coverage and all the things that have gone on and been critiqued by many, many people in recent years, I'm not defending their brand of journalism at this point in time. I think it's shameful in many respects. But and I think I advise my students when I've taught several different courses since I've been at Boston University, and I urge them to read the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, one or two other, New Republic, the Weekly Standard, and if they have time for.
And what about internet journalists? Do you have
a lot of them?
I would certainly agree with you that when you go out there and you see the views of the world, as the gentleman also said, there's no question you realize that there's obviously a diversity of opinion. But I'd also agree with Bob that obviously there is a level of diversity going on here. But I think that what I would say is it's the degree of diversity. It's how narrow the argument seems to be pulled. From the U.S. perspective is very narrow, and I think that's part of the problem that we're experiencing when the world community comes back to us and says, "Hey, we all have a center, we all have a personal view of the world." But it does seem as if the U.S. position, and this probably has a lot to do with we're the only superpower left. There is a kind of assumption that, we're the big kid on the block, so we basically get to put our position out.
But there is a terrible lack of sophistication in terms of the American point of view. And there's there is simply not a process. Instead of the process as the world becomes more complex, certainly after the defeat of the Soviet Union.
I think the nuancing that one of the journalists commented about, the U.S. ability to understand some of the subtle nuances. We have a generation that really has not been fed that level of the nuance. So, yes.
Well, and may I add that when they brought up the BBC, Chris could work for the BBC. He's probably one of the few people who could, because if you listen to them, they at least ask hard questions and don't take their answers to be answers and come back and ask them another question, whereas you do not hear that on American television or American radio. Thank you. I'll let
Susan,
other people
thank you.
ask questions.
Hello. I'm mainly... I haven't really seen any recent coverage of Afghanistan in the news, and so I'm as far as everyone weighing in on where they get their news from, I mainly read the Christian Science Monitor and do internet websites here and there. I just got this thing called Ampheta Desk, which is some sort of news digester. But basically, what is the status of Hamid Karzai's government? And as far as how stable they are and what's going on over there. I know they're in a lot of trouble. And then my second question would be, is there some sort of administration policy document on what exactly the administration's position on the war on terrorism is and how they're going to wage this that I can read somewhere? Thank you very much.
Excellent questions.
Thank you.
I think that in terms of the Karzai government, some of the points that we tried to, that we did get when we were there had to do with some of the ground problems. For instance, a lot of the donor money has not been delivered. One of the justifications is that there's not enough stability, but we've also observed that there are inconsistencies in helping the Karzai government gain the stability he needs. So, we're dealing with issues here that have to do, and again, this is why we do feel that if the United States really had in its own mind that it's in our interest, and I agree with you, Bob, that it definitely does come from a center of it would be in our interest to create a stable Afghanistan. We do feel that is in our self-interest, and that we could assist in creating a very moderate Islamic state, which historically it had always been pretty much one of the more moderate states. So you have a potential of creating stability. You have a potential of also assisting creation of democracy in a very real form. And the Karzai government definitely needs that kind of assistance now in order to build the infrastructure. We're talking about 75% of Kabul is destroyed. Now imagine if Boston was 75% destroyed. How much assistance would you need to maintain some kind of basic services and integrity? There are problems with the fact that because the money isn't coming in, the pay is not being sent out, you have officials that aren't being paid. This lends more to corruption and to payoffs and all other kinds of problems. So you can see where some kind of investment, serious investment in terms of directing the energy and the money where it needs to go, following it through, and looking at these things as in the interest of the United States definitely needs to be incorporated.
Please.
It's hard to stay relevant because you wait to get your question. We're jumping back and forth, and I'm going to do it again, from journalism to Afghanistan. And I want to go back to the journalism discussion. First, a comment to Bob before I get to what I really wanted to say. You spoke about how there's been a lot of dissent reported, disagreement about policy and so forth. And my feeling is, yes, there has, but again, it's all the same. It's become okay, for whatever reasons, what I don't fully understand, to talk about this kind of thing, so it gets covered, but it's covered by all the stations, all the networks, the kind of thing you were pointing out.
In a kind of, Paul is calling it a theme park coverage. We
Yeah,
go and visit. We
one.
visit the dissent booth every once in a while.
Right. But then I want to talk about Gloria. Go back to Gloria Steinem. Whatever the intent was, now I know our government didn't go to Afghanistan to help the women take off their burqas. But there was, after we had the Northern Alliance had their little victories up north and so forth, and we went into Kabul, we heard, I'm not a journalist, I'm a person that reads the paper, we heard this great triumph, the good things you reported just now. We saw the pictures, women dancing around and guys getting to get videos and so forth. So it was all about that kind of liberalization. Now, I don't know why that came out. I think maybe because it's what we wanted to hear. And the questions that I get to, which nobody knows, I guess, some of it is you journalists only get access to certain things. Others are that your bosses want to have certain things covered, not for nefarious reasons, but because it's interesting and popular, and I want to hear about it. I had many friends, women friends, say, "See, it was worth."
What should they have done? What should they have done with those pictures, which were probably arranged in the first place? But
yes,
I mean, to my mind, it's just absurdly irresponsible to present an impression that is so far from what we know to be the truth of the war. I find it despicable. And I find it also despicable among lots of people I know, male as well as female, that they said, "Oh well, it'll be good for the women of Afghanistan."
Yeah, but it's in keeping. It's in keeping with the general cynicism of the reporting. I mean, the administration knows
that's not reporters. That's
the administration knows that no
editors.
matter what they say, that it's not going to make any difference in terms of what's reported, in terms of what their intentions are. It's not going to stop them. They're simply going to, they've had an agenda with Afghanistan. The Soviets had an agenda with Afghanistan 20 years ago and clamped down on press coverage, threw out 1,136 journalists in January of 1980, and the United States is effectively behaving the same way. And you get there and you say, what the heck is going on here? Why doesn't anybody want to talk about this place? It's a meeting place of all these worlds. The Chinese are there, the Iranians are there, the KGB is still active in some cases, apparently with the Northern Alliance. There's all kinds of issues going on with the Americans there, the Special Forces versus the 82nd Airborne, and there are various different kinds of approaches to the problem. We were told that the Special Forces were actually doing more reconstruction work than most of the United Nations aid groups were doing. And that's another big question.
Can I just comment, and this gets back to the matter of coverage of dissent, Bob. It seems to me the big picture of the coverage is that there's a certain learned helplessness in the opposition and in the coverage of it, as if we're going through the motions. You have to explain that in Iraq, say, there might be difficulties in an urban war, but it's not said as if to join an argument. It's sort of said for the sake of saying it. I'm struck that in Afghanistan and Iraq, these are two countries that I think, and I don't mean to be disrespectful, but our president would have had a hard time finding on a map on the day he was inaugurated. The press is not trying to teach him and us and Congress all together about the realities of this world. I mean, it's playing games. It's playing games with our heads and our emotions when it makes a big deal about women dancing about their liberation.
I saw a spate of articles, and in fact, and one important article in a scholarly journal, the Foreign Affairs, by the former CIA chief in Kabul, warning the president in the most categorical way that Afghanistan has been the ruin of empires over the years. We saw journalist after journalist talking about how the Brits had come to grief there. I mean, I'm not a historian, The only reason I know all these things is because I read them in the newspapers at the time and in the various journals. That I had that story told about the British retreat where they started out with, was it 16,000 and ended up with one live person. Where did I get that if it wasn't? And is that not a fundamental criticism of the policy or a fundamental
we are
warning
going
about
through, we read our way through some of those motions, but it seems to me that the coverage is not designed either to sting or to educate. It's more or less, I feel a considerable self-marginalization by the press and the media in this thing. Please, take us someplace else.
Okay. My name is Ubaid Nijari, and I'm representing Afghanistan Civil Rights Foundation tonight. And I want to thank you for your wonderful analysis tonight. I'd like to say that Afghanistan has not only been named as the graveyard of invaders, but also the graveyard of analysts and journalists and their mistakes and misanalysis. Anyway, I would like to, tonight I would like to highlight two areas where, in our opinion, the U.S. media failed very badly. First was the fact that U.S. media failed to take into account and consider the ethnic realities of Afghanistan. And we believe this this resulted into contributing to policy mistakes that the U.S. made in its approach towards Afghanistan. For example, one of the mistakes that the U.S. media made was the constant reference to the Pashtuns as the majority ethnic group, while we know that they only make 38% of the population and far from being the majority ethnic group in Afghanistan. So the failure to take into account the ethnic realities of Afghanistan, that was the first mistake. And the second mistake that the U.S. media made was its heavy reliance on Pakistani input. And we know that Pakistan had a conflict of interest in Afghanistan. It was the creator of the Taliban, and it was trying to use the Pashtuns as its client ethnic group and as a policy instrument in Afghanistan. So this reliance on Pakistani input through the Pakistani journalists, consultants, translators, and guides resulted in a coverage with bias in favor of the Pashtuns and hostile towards the non-Pashtuns. So what do you have to say on these two areas? Thank you.
I think you're totally right. I think there's no question that
I would say that the entire situation is the one thing that we heard again and again from many of the people who were working with the American journalists, the translators, would sit there and they would just simply shake their head and they said, "You Americans, this is not a simple situation, but you're behaving as if it is. You've been spoiled by the Cold War. You had one enemy for so long, and you knew who they were, and you built it up, and now you have this big, overwhelming architecture, and you don't see anything. You don't see the people. You don't see the arguments. You don't see the politics." And you almost look back from there, you look back at the United States and say, we really don't engage in politics here any longer. It gets presented to us. We get a choice of turkey dinner, roast turkey with potatoes. Or we can have the roast beef, or we can have the granola menu if we'd like. And we kind of get it all. All requests are satisfied. But are we really getting to the issue? I think we've really. I think in terms of and this is this whole business about Western civilization, I think Afghanistan is a test for us, quite frankly. And the people that were there who are working with these people on the ground, Americans who are working with these Afghans on the ground, feel the same way. You can sense it when you go back there. Oh, this is what it's like to create a country. This is what it's like to live in the ground. This is what it's like to be. These people are so democratically minded. They can't get along with anything. They can't get along. They're totally independent, very democratic minded.